Okay, welcome back to class. Last week we were discussing the most famous of all the mammoths that were found frozen in Siberia and up in Alaska and Canada. And this one was found in Siberia, and this was the Berezovka mammoth. And as we started talking about last week, we wanted to talk about the cause of death of Berezovka. So it was determined that Berezovka's death was determined to be actually by suffocation. And one of the signs of suffocation is basically that blood would have been found to be coagulated in its capillaries. And capillaries are very small, tiny hair-like blood veins that connect to the smaller arteries. Coagulated also means for a substance, in this case blood, to change to a thickened semi-solid or a solid mass, as happens with blood when it clots. So also, there were similar signs of asphyxia and inhalation of dust and silts in the respiratory tracts, like the trachea and lungs. Also, interestingly, the stomach contents were well preserved and show little signs of breakdowns by enzymes. And this is very unexpected. So at normal body temperatures, stomach acids and enzymes break down stomach contents within a couple of hours, maybe even an hour or so. So the mammoth's large thermal mass would have kept and should have kept the stomach warm for a long time, even if Berezovka had died in the coldest of Siberian winter storms. So since the body was rapidly buried, this is even more perplexing, since the burial should have protected from exposure to the cold. So the plants found in the stomach and mouth were so well preserved that each of these species of fauna could easily and be readily identified. So the only thing that makes sense is that Berezovka must have been flash frozen, must have been frozen so fast that that its stomach contents would have been preserved before they started to actually be decayed by these enzymes in the stomach. So the only thing that makes sense is that this animal, Berezovka, must have been flash frozen immediately upon death at a seemingly impossible low temperature. Um, so it's almost as if the body was buried in something colder than dry ice. So dry ice, if you're familiar with it, is actually not water. It's the solid form of carbon dioxide when it's at 109.2 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. And experiments have shown that the outer layers of skin of this animal would have to drop suddenly to at least 150 to 175 degrees below Fahrenheit to rapidly freeze this animal and preserve its stomach contents before they would have had a chance to start have been decayed. So another point too is the animal cells were not burst, and frozen food experts had pointed out that you would have to have a sudden drop of a temperature well below negative 150 degrees Fahrenheit in order for the blood, for the cells not to have burst. So how the temperature? The question here, of course, how could it get that cold that fast? And we will answer that question as we go through this. Some plants found in the stomach were not native to Siberia also, today where this animal was found. So how could that be? And the extreme preservation that also told examiners when the plants were eaten. So inexplicably, this seemingly pointed to a late summer death when temperatures would have been warmer, not extreme cold. So every time a frozen mammoth's time of death has been determined, the estimates usually are of a late summer or early fall time frame. This is surprising if each death were random and speaks to the possibility that there's some kind of an unusual large-scale event that would have killed all these at the same time and preserved their bodies. And that right there ought to get you thinking a little bit here. And warm weather deaths fly in the face of traditional theories attempting to explain the preservation of frozen mammoths. So we're going to look into multiple theories about how these animals would have been frozen in these conditions. And what's also more unusual is that the recovery team found that this animal's meat, when it thawed out, was not putrid or rotten, but it was fresh enough and fresh enough that actually some of their sled dogs ate some of it and didn't get sick. Very unusual, and I don't think I would have tried that, but their dogs did, and they didn't get sick. So close examination of Berezovka's soft tissues showed that the cell walls had not burst, as they would have if they would have approached normal freezing temperature rates. So for this to happen, a cell needs to freeze very rapidly um, before breakdown produces water within the membranes. Otherwise, the water's expansion upon freezing tears the cell open. So again, frozen food experts say, hey, this would have to have been sudden freezing at an extremely low temperature. And the puzzle of replicating these observations are almost unbelievable. So remember last week we talked about the crushed leg bone, which indicated a rapid burial soon after death, which would have insulated the still warm body. So Berezovka would have had to have been buried in contact with at least some film material so I lost my place here. Some material, of incredibly low temperature. So how could this happen? So to make things even more mysterious too, we've just discussed experiments have shown that in order to freeze a mammoth this fast to prohibit stomach enzymes, acids and enzymes from breaking down the vegetable matter in their stomachs, we would have to have at least negative 150 degrees below zero to do this. So the Bird's Eye Frozen Foods Company ran the calculations and came up with a staggering 150 degrees below zero or lower would be needed to accomplish this. And all this would needed to occur within an hour or so of the animal eating what was found in their stomach. So this would have been a very sudden event. This would have happened just almost immediately. So for the animal cells not to burst open, this just seems like an impossible situation. And to make this even more perplexing is the fact that the coldest temperature that's ever been recorded on Earth is not even close to being that cold. The lowest natural temperature ever recorded directly on ground level on Earth is minus 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was measured at the then Soviet Vostok station in Antarctica, the South Pole, near the South Pole, on July 21st of 1983. This was taken by ground measurements. Antarctica is the coldest and windiest and driest of all of Earth's continents. This temperature was measured very near the South Pole, but the frozen mammoths, of course, were not found anywhere near the South Pole. They were found above the Arctic Circle in Siberia. It gets very cold there, but it doesn't even get to negative 128 there, 128 degrees below zero. So how could it possibly get that cold? And as you might guess, shortly we'll discover that hydroplate theory provides a scientifically supported answer for this seemingly impossible condition. So first, before we answer the question and some of these other questions, I would like to look into the various theories that attempt to explain the mysteries of the frozen mammoths. So in his book, Dr. Brown states that there are 10 different theories, including the hydroplate theory, that have been proposed to explain the frozen mammoth puzzle. So as he does this, Dr. Brown first explains the basics of each theory in the book, as an advocate of each theory would explain each of them. So we'll do a very short summary of each one of those to see which one best explains the numerous evidences that need to be explained by each theory. Some will be quite easy to discuss, others will bring up other subjects along the way that will be relevant to our study. And so I think this would be a good time to include some of these things in our class. So originally when I was putting this class together, I wasn't really going to delve much into this section of the book. However, when I mentioned this to certain members of my immediate family, they strongly felt otherwise. And they said they would be disappointed if I didn't cover this material. And it's of course changed my perspective on it. And so I began to look a little deeper into these theories and how to best present them in class. And as I did, I started to realize that there could be much benefit to take the time to cover these theories, at least briefly, for a couple of reasons. First, I think it will be a good exercise as to how best evaluate scientific theories and see how that should be done. And then compare them so that you have all the information available in order to make the best decision on what theory best fits the evidences. This seemingly is something a little too lacking in today's academic world. Too often, students are told what to think and not taught how to think critically. Why is that? So let's look back just a little bit of history. Um, Before the field of geology started in the early 1800s, a common explanation for major geological features of the Earth up until that time was a global flood. Up until that time, many held the Bible in very high regard and looked at the the world through the perspective of the Bible. However, many of the earliest of the geologists were hostile to such explanations for three reasons. First, many geologists were opposed to the Bible, which spoke of a global flood. Uh, the second would be that flood explanations seemed and were sometimes scientifically simplistic, and therefore a lot of times were dismissed by these geologists. And finally, because the global flood is an unrepeatable catastrophe, it cannot be studied directly. Um, so by definition, catastrophes are large, rarely repeated, and difficult or impossible to reproduce. The flaw in this exclusionary logic is that catastrophes can occur. They involve many phenomena, and they leave widespread wreckage and strange details that require explanations. Most of these phenomena are testable and repeatable on a smaller scale. But how are these catastrophes disallowed? So early professors in the new and growing field of geology were primarily selected from those who supported an anti-catastrophe doctrine. These professors did not advocate advanced students who were open to the possibility of catastrophes, especially the global flood. And many people, of course, resist submitting to God for many reasons, and it certainly seems to be the case with many of these early scientists in the mid to late 1800s. Many, of course, who were influenced by the works of Darwin and the theory of evolution as it gained support in the mid to later 1800s. So the theory of evolution, of course, is presented that God's not necessary, it's not needed in order to explain origins, and that blind random chance can produce a universe with everything contained inside the universe, including life. And you'll get complex order from randomness if you just give it enough time. So over and over again, I've read numerous quotes saying, hey, just give it enough time and what's seemingly impossible not only becomes possible, but it becomes probable. That's not scientific, and there's many problems with that. So if you get it billions and billions of years, their thought is it's just bound to happen. But that isn't the case. I think that's not scientifically logical. So an advocate of the global flood at that time was branded as a biblical literalist or maybe even a science denier, and therefore not worthy of an academic degree. And geology professors who are also influenced through the peer review process would publish only papers that could be published by the general consensus. And the textbooks soon started to reflect this. So few students would even be exposed to the massive evidence supporting creation and a global flood. They wouldn't even be given the opportunity to consider that evidence. So this practice continues to today because of major criteria of selecting professors is the number of their publications and their adherence to evolutionary theory. And you'll find that the academic world today is very hostile toward anything to do with creation, anything to do with the Bible. And there's a movie that was out called Expelled, which if you haven't seen, you probably should see, and it goes through this. It was done by Ben Stein, who's a well-known figure, but he goes through the hostility that is found today in the academic world to anybody who would even consider something like that the Earth is not billions of years old and that it was created by a creator. So disallowing catastrophes produces a mindset where strange observations are ignored or considered unbelievable, not viewed as possibly important diagnostic details worthy of our testing or consideration. Of course, this is totally the opposite of what really should be considered as to be good science, which should consider all the evidences available and then evaluate those evidences in order to come to the best conclusion. So looking deeper into these various theories, I think will also show how well researched this was by Dr. Brown and how science should operate. And in addition, there are going to be several side subjects that will be run up along the way, subjects I do want to cover or had wanted to cover at some point during the class. But because they're mentioned in this section, it seems like a good time to cover them. So in order to easily compare theories, Dr. Brown provides a table in his book under this chapter about the mammoths, the frozen mammoths, that summarizes how well each theory explains many of the strange evidences associated with the frozen mammoths. And he does this also for other topics he covers in the book. I find this very helpful. It's a really good way to be able to have a pretty easy visual comparison of a lot of these theories. And then it shows also how well some of these evidences are explained by the particular theories we're going to discuss. So each vertical column here represents a theory, and it has the name of the theory listed from left to right across the top of the chart, as you'll see here. And you'll see the 10 theories starting on the left, with hydroplate theory, and then lake drowning theory, crevice theory, mud burial, and so forth. Each horizontal row represents an unusual detail that requires an explanation. So there are 19 evidences listed on the left of this chart from top to bottom, and a robust theory or viable theory should be able to reasonably explain much, if not all, of these evidences. We won't go through all of them, but we're going to do the key ones, the ones I think that are key. Then he provides a key that represents the specific theory's ability to explain the particular evidence. So using the analogy of a traffic light, he uses a green circle, which means go, a yellow means caution, and the red, of course, means stop, or it doesn't explain, the theory doesn't explain the particular evidence. So green, thus, in Dr. Brown's opinion, represents the column's theory reasonably does explain the row's diagnostic detail. The yellow, of course, and red indicates moderate and serious problems, respectively, with the theory's ability to explain this evidence. And then there's various numbers you'll see in this table. It's called Table 6 in the book, that refer to larger, more in-depth details that are in his book. So it's quite in-depth and it's quite detailed, and it's out of the scope of a class for us to cover all of this. So I'm going to go through some of it, and I would encourage you, if you have interest, to go ahead and read this yourself. The book's available completely free online. It's now is available in print, the latest edition. And I think you'll find that there's a lot of benefit in doing this. And in doing so, we can see right off the bat here that the hydroplate theory is the only one that seemingly seems to explain all or virtually all of these evidences. And none of the others are nearly as robust as hydroplate theory. So here we should start thinking as a scientist thinks. It's important to note that there is typically some disagreement in the scientific and creationist communities regarding some of these evidences. So I'd recommend you look into this deeper yourself if you're interested, so you can make up your own mind. So Dr. Brown points out that fruitful and robust theories answer not only obvious initial questions, but also solve perplexing and seemingly unrelated problems. We've seen this so far in the class. As we unravel the mystery of the frozen mammoths, we may answer even broader questions and uncover a sequence of dramatic global events. And this then becomes a subject that is actually much deeper than it appears to be on the surface. So Dr. Brown also states robust theories also provide details that result in surprising and testable predictions. Predictions are a very important part of a good scientific theory. If a scientific theory can make predictions that are later discovered to be true, you have a lot of confidence in that theory actually having merit. If predictions made by a particular theory don't come to be, then you start to have a lot of doubts whether the theory is a good theory. So with each of these, he advocates that you ask yourself, what predictions can this theory make? If your predictions are missing, the theory is probably weak. If theories could not be published unless they included many details and specific predictions, we would be spared from many distractions and false ideas. So first, let's briefly explain or summarize some of the key evidences that need to be explained. This is what we find in the vertical row of the chart on the left here. And again, we're not going to do all these because it would take quite a bit of time, but and some of these we have already mentioned somewhat earlier in the class. So the first one is the mystery of abundant food that would have been required for these animals to live and survive. So we just covered this in last week's class. that these animals would require a very large food source. So any theory as to this mystery should explain how there could have been so much food available for them, not only to eat, but actually be quite well fed, noting that many had extensive layers of fat, which indicate abundant food supplies. So remember that elephants would spend most of their day feeding, and it would follow that mammoths, who are so closely related to elephants, would also have a requirement for a lot of food, 300 to 600 pounds of food per day. We also discussed the abundant food would have required a warm climate, much warmer than Siberia is today for abundant food to be present. So we saw little of the food found in Berezovka's mouth and stomach doesn't grow in the Arctic Circle today. It doesn't grow in that area. In fact, it's barren. There's very little vegetation there. And furthermore, the flower fragments and seeds from flowering plants that were found in Berezovka's stomach show that it died during warm weather. So despite the popular misconception, there's a strong indication that the mammoth was a temperate, not an Arctic animal. And flowers, of course, don't grow in such cold temperatures around or above the Arctic Circle. Another is that the mammoth finds are multi-continental. So the soft parts of animals have been preserved over about a 3,000 mile wide zone involving 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and North America. And it is unlikely that so many unrelated local events would produce such similar results over such a large geographical area. So a good, robust theory should be able to explain this, should be able to explain how this could have occurred over such a large area. Another is explaining large amounts of what is called rock ice. So we'll explain rock ice here since it's being brought up. Rock ice is a strange, granular ice containing clay, sand, and plant material in a large volume of air pockets. And so we should discuss that a little bit more here because I wasn't familiar with this before I ever heard of this. This is another interesting discovery that supports the hydroplate theory. In fact, hydroplate theory is the only theory that even attempt to explain the origin of this type of ice. And in Siberia and Alaska, scientists have found this strange type of ice in and under the massive amount of muck that contains the mammoth remains. So this chart here helps to show what are considered to be the various types of ice, and then compares that to the characteristics of what has been termed rock ice. You might think that all ice is basically the same, as I did, but it turns out there's at least 3 different types of ice. So ice varies due to the bubble content and the bubble percentage contained within the ice, and the type of dissolved air within the ice, and the granularity, color, and dirt content of the ice. These types of ice can then be categorized into 3 different categories, what is termed type 1, type 2, and type 3 ice. A few examples that differentiate these types of ice are the bubbles contained within the ice. You'll see that on the left side of the chart here. The bubbles that are inside the ice can tell us a lot about how the ice formed. For example, type 1 ice has few bubbles that in the ice that are the size of a pinhead due to being formed in water that freezes, being either stationary or slowly moving. If we move to the next ice, type 2 ice, it's different in that now type 2 ice contains many air pockets. So this would be the case as it would be with snow, for example. And we see examples of this in glaciers and icebergs and on winter roads. The third type of ice contains large pockets of trapped between ice particles, and this type of ice is found when water freezes while rapidly moving through cold air or even outer space. So on the far right of the chart are the characteristics of rock ice. And what we'll see now is that rock ice most closely resembled type 3 ice. So what's important to our discussion is that mammoth remains have been found above, below, beside, partially in, and in one case, totally encased within rock ice. One characteristic of rock ice is it often has a yellow tinge and contains round or elongated bubbles. Some bubbles are connected, while others, an inch or so long, are vertically streaked. So the important clue here is that this type of ice most closely matches the type 3 ice that forms as water freezes, moving rapidly through cold air, or as we mentioned, outer space. And it was also reported in the American Journal of Science from 1881 that this rock looked like compacted hail. This is a key clue here. This might be what would be expected if there was a massive ice dump of muddy hail, just as predicted when so much water and sediments fell back to the earth during the rupture of the crust when the fountains of the great deep burst forth. We'll go into that a little bit more as we go through this further, but this should start giving you some clues as this was not normal. There's something unusual going on here. Looking at a little bit of history here, originally a man named Bernard Edward Toll in the late 1800s may have been the first one to write about this strange ice. He named it stone ice, and Toll and his 3 companions disappeared in 1903 while on a mammoth expedition to Bennett Island, which is an island off the north coast of Siberia, and a rescue attempt to find Toll failed. But his diary was found on Bennett Island 3 years later and reported that another frozen mammoth had been discovered. And unfortunately, just weren't very many details to this that were given in what they found. And then later, a scientist named I.P. Tolmakov is credited for actually naming this type of ice rock ice. Tolmakov was a professor of paleontology at the University of Pittsburgh, and he published numerous papers, including ones on mammoths and rhinos that were found frozen in the ground in Siberia. So it is apparent that this ice is more commonly now called rock ice, and it has some specific characteristics to the type 3 ice we just talked about, but it still has some important differences that make it actually unique from type 3 ice. Sometimes rock ice also contains plant particles in thin layers of sand or clay. So had water frozen the normal way, dirt would have settled out of the ice because it's heavier, and vegetable matter, because it's lighter, would have floated upward. Obviously, this kind of ice must have frozen rapidly and was never part of a lake or a stream. So what could cause this to be frozen so fast that this material that normally would have been either filtered out of or risen to the top of, it didn't form that way. So again, special circumstances must have occurred in order for this phenomenon to have happened. And then several feet beneath Berezovka mammoth was a layer of rock ice, and it was sloped more than 180 feet down to the river. And after digging into it, some of the scientists that were there reported perhaps the strangest characteristic of rock ice. And they state here, deeper down in the cliff, the ice becomes more solid and transparent, in some places entirely white and brittle. After remaining exposed to the air for even a short period of time, this ice again assumes a yellowish brown color and looks like the old ice. So obviously there's something in the air, probably oxygen, that reacted chemically with something in the ice. Why was air, primarily oxygen and nitrogen, not already dissolved in this ice? So just as liquid water dissolves table salt, sugar, and many other solids, water also dissolves gases in contact with it. For example, virtually all water and ice on Earth are nearly saturated with air. Had air been dissolved in Hertz's rock ice before it suddenly turned yellowish brown, the chemical reaction would have already occurred. But it didn't. It happened when it was exposed to air. So in the comparison chart in Dr. Brown's book we looked at just a few slides back, the rock ice is unsaturated with dissolved air, unlike any of the other 3 types of ice. There should have been, under normal circumstances, more dissolved air within this ice if it formed under more normal conditions. And this is the indication, again, that these circumstances were not normal. There was something very unusual going on here. And there are other features of other types of ice that are not present in rock ice that indicate, again, that this ice formed in a different way. Because such thick layers of rock ice still exist, an enormous amount of water probably froze while moving through the cold air, possibly outer space. So what possibly explains this? So I'm glad you asked that. I know you're in here because you want your questions answered, right? The most logical answer is provided by the hydroplates theory, explanation of a hail dump following the rupture of the crust. So very literal, fountains of the great deep, when the flood started, shot up and accelerated very high up into the atmosphere at supersonic speeds. We've gone through this a little bit, that there have been plenty of energy in this subterranean water, and the gravitational forces would have shot uh, rocks and water and debris high up into the atmosphere. So as the fountains of the Great Deep exploded up through the atmosphere, rapid and steady evaporation from the rising liquid forces gases away from instead of toward each rising liquid particle. Therefore, the water that froze above the atmosphere had little dissolved air but much carbon dioxide. Both froze to become a mixture of water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, or dry ice. As we talked about earlier, dry ice is frozen carbon dioxide. Ice absorbs air very slowly. Once it turns to ice, it can't absorb air like it does when it's in liquid form. Especially when the inner portion of a large volume of falling ice particles, so little air was absorbed as this muddy hail fell back to Earth. Once the ice was on warm ground, some dry ice and water ice slowly evaporated as white clouds, and as the ice depths increased to perhaps several hundred feet, these clouds billowed up through the gaps between the ice particles, forcing out any air that might have been between them, and eventually the weight of the topmost layers of ice essentially sealed the lower ice from the air above. This is why Hertz and other explorers saw ice under Berezovka that turned yellow-brown as the ice first contacted and chemically reacted with the air. So the Ice Age followed the flood, and we're going to discuss that in more detail in the coming slides. But since then, the surface of the ground in Siberia and Alaska has melted slightly each summer in some parts of Siberia and Alaska, and this included several feet of rock ice. And when this layer of dirty ice melts, the water drains away, leaving particles of dirt and vegetation behind. This remaining clay and silt provides an insulating blanket, causing less ice to melt each succeeding year, and most of this unsorted clay and silt above rock ice came from this melted ice. We'll also see as we go on, there's a big reason why this would have remained frozen. I'll leave that as a little mystery, but we'll talk about that as the class goes on as well. We also earlier discussed the mystery of frozen muck, which is what a lot of these animals have been frozen in. So where did incredible amounts of soil that contains decomposing animal and plant matter come from? That's what muck is. Another mystery is not listed in this chart that also should be explained is to how so many trees buried deep below the muck can be explained. So recall that vast amounts of frozen trees have been found under 1,000 feet or more of frozen muck. What explains this? It seems there must have been a sudden and very dramatic freezing accompanied by a very rapid burial that's now frozen solid. And once again, the mystery of frozen muck is only explained by hydroplate theory. Again, we'll explain this as we go through the various theories as well. Next on the list of something we want to explain is the very sudden and dramatic freezing. And some of the frozen mammoths and rhinoceroses would have decayed partially, would have undecayed, partially chewed or digested food preserved in their mouths, stomachs, or intestines. For this to happen, again, as we talked about, they would have to have been frozen at an incredibly low temperature very quickly in order to preserve this. So water, expands as it freezes. So we saw when an animal dies and decay begins, decomposing amino acids in each cell produce water that ruins the meat's taste. The water expands as it freezes. The cell, if it freezes with enough water and accumulated in it, will tear the cell. So there's no evidence of that in these animals. So it must have had, again, some very unusual circumstances for this to have occurred. Following the sudden freezing on the chart is the suffocation and dirty lungs. So at least 3 mammoths and 2 rhinoceroses were found to have been suffocated. And if the animal was covered very fast, the cause of death in some would have actually been from suffocation. In addition, the respiratory and digestive tracts of some mammoths contain silt and clay, small particles of gravel. Just before death, it seems that they would have had to have breathed air or ate food containing silt and clay and small particles that would have been in the air. So silt is defined as a very fine-grained solid sediment composed of rock and mineral particles such as quartz and feldspar. And these particles are larger than clay but smaller than sand. And an important clue here is quartz and feldspar are found in granite that makes up much of the Earth's continental crust. So we'll see as this fountain of the great deep bursts forth, it sends a lot of this matter up into the air and would have come back down and been suspended in the air and then breathed in by some of these animals. It's also another strange one to consider. This one's the mystery of what are called peppered tusks, and I actually added the word bombarded here because I think that word will show that there's evidence of their tusks actually been bombarded by particles, very small particles that have struck the tusks of these animals at very high velocity, but only from one direction. So scientists are finding over a wide geographical area mammoth tusks have been found embedded on one side only with millimeter-sized particles rich in iron and nickel. This has led some to wonder that if meteorites exploding high in the atmosphere must have done this, must have punctured those tusks. So here's a photo of one of the such tusks that was struck. Similar markings on many tusks are found over a wide area. Again, this suggests that a single common event was responsible for this unusual find. This indicates that it wasn't a series of unrelated separate events. The British Broadcasting Corporation stated startling evidence has been found which shows mammoth and other great beasts from the last ice age were blasted with material that came from space. But is that the whole story? Do we have evidence of that? We don't have any evidence of that. But there is an explanation that we can find from hydroplate theory. So as we look back, we recall that large amounts of water that was supercritical, this is water at very high temperatures, very high pressure under the crust, as seen here, would have accelerated many solids upward into the atmosphere and even into outer space with an astounding amount of energy released when the crust ruptured. And this happened when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, Genesis 7:11. I think this is what's happening here. So a table in the book in the beginning estimates the magnitude of this energy that would have launched these materials into the atmosphere and even beyond in outer space would have been incredible. It would have, as we discussed earlier, given us a scientifically based explanation for the origin of comets and asteroids and meteors. But also note that iron and nickel are found both in the crust and the mantle of Earth, and have been included in this material that would have rained back down on the Earth as the flood progressed on, and over a very large geographical area. So this would have spread out over a large area. And I think in general, we only just consider that the 40 days and 40 nights that were described in Genesis were rain composed of water. But we also should realize that much more than water would have fallen back to Earth. It would have contained rocks, dirt, plant debris, and a lot more. So as iron and nickel fell back down to the surface of the Earth, it would have done so at a very high rate of speed and high enough speed to become embedded in the tusks of these mammoths. And of course, if these mammoths were standing, it would have only struck their tusks on one side, the side that's generally faced up when the animal is in a standing position. Next on the list is the super low temperature of 150 degrees or lower below zero. So again, this is a significant aspect because we've just talked about, it's never been measured. That temperature is that low, it's never been measured on the Earth. Of course, stomach acids work continuously to break down food in the stomachs, and the actual breakdown speed, of course, depends on what's being digested, but plant foods serve as a primary source of food for these mammoths. And the rhinos that were buried, and the plants are considered carbohydrates that will break down in the stomach between 1 to 2 hours. So how could these animals have undigested food in their stomach unless virtually immediately frozen? So again, this is the only the hydroplate theory can answer this. And again, as we go through this, we'll discuss this in greater detail as well. Vegetation also in the stomachs and intestines implies that they may have died in late summer or early fall, perhaps August or even July. Investigation of seeds and grass from the intestines of some of these mammals indicate that they must have died in the autumn, according to one report titled Frozen Mammoths from Siberia. Another one said that grass seeds testify to a death in summer, perhaps even specifically the month of August. Now, these are estimates based on what are considered normal circumstances, um, and attempting to determine the time of year when these animals died. However, the different methods investigators have for estimating the season of death give slightly different times. Some differences may be because the pre-flood climates are most likely and certainly would have been quite different than what we have today. So if this rapid freezing and preservation of vegetation of the stomachs of these animals was indeed as a result of the flood, freezing must have occurred shortly after the beginning of the flood when they were hit with a massive ice dump of extremely cold hail. And we will discuss here in the next coming week or two how it could have gotten so cold so fast to have frozen these animals. So this, again, indicates that it was extremely rapid and must have happened just right after the rupture of the fountains of the Great Deep and as the Great Flood started, as this material started to rain back down to Earth.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.